And so for today's last speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Robert Fox from this university, who's going to give a short summary of today's proceedings.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been quite a day. We began with the first James Vincent's paper this morning, taking us back to ancient Egypt. He ventured into the Middle Ages rather tentatively, but that chronologically was as far as he went. But I think the message that came across very strongly in James's paper, and of course it's come out in other papers as well, is that measurement isn't an intrinsic feature of the world. It's a practice that humanity has invented and even imposed on culture, particularly on Western culture, with administrative and spiritual dimensions that have been mentioned in other papers today. And I think that human fashioning of the measurement practice, the world of measurement, I think that's come up really consistently both morning and afternoon. Richard Brown picked it up in his story. That was the story of the revolutionary imposition of the metric system in France. And it's a story that went on in Richard's paper to the International System of Units in its first iteration in 1960, and on to the revised SI that we're using in the 21st century. And he assured us that these unimaginably precisely defined quantities that really take your breath away, he assured us that the system was, as he said, future-proofed. I'm not sure quite how far he'd want to be held to that, but certainly that is clearly the goal of the new SI. And along the way, during the day, we've been asked to reflect on fundamental questions. Jane Wess was exploring the idea of what a measuring instrument is, how measuring instruments have evolved over the years, and how the nature, I think what emerged strongly from Jane's paper was how the nature of an instrument is related, so closely related to what we measure, where we measure, how we measure, whether we measure in the field, for example, using instruments and procedures that might be deemed to be fairly rough and ready, or whether we measure in the laboratory in the more modern sense with a premium on these extraordinary levels of accuracy and precision, when, of course, procedures and instruments are anything but rough and ready. And I think that a conclusion that emerged from Jane's talk, her discussion of the intricate relationship between complex interaction between how, what, and where we measure, that emerged in a sort of a lineage, but also a sort of hierarchy of instruments that were becoming more sophisticated, more difficult to make, and so on as time progressed. And then this afternoon, Jo Wolfe asked a very different question. Her question, I think, really boiled down to the question that was actually the title she gave on the preliminary program, Jo, I think. Can we be realists about measurement? And in other words, should we believe, or can we believe, that measurable attributes exist independently in space and time, independently of the methods and procedures that we construct to do the measuring? I think realism in that sense, in that extreme sense, that purist sense, that was something that Jo rejected pretty firmly. But what remained was the possibility, I think, in her talk of qualified realism. And I had the sense that a lot of the work that she and I think colleagues in Edinburgh probably are doing, I think what emerged quite strongly was the sense that a qualified realism might be possible, provided we think very clearly what we understand by realism and by what we understand by the elements, the counter-elements, of operationalism and other approaches that we might want to incorporate in a qualified realist position. And I think in talking about that question, Joe was delivering a message that resonated very strongly with Hasok Chang's urging. I mean, it was Joe's urging as well, but Hasok's urging that we should think hard about the quantitative attributes that we set out to measure, how we conceive them, how we arrive at them. And Hasok himself did that in the wonderful book on inventing temperature that he mentioned in his lecture. And Hasok, there in that book, led us through the history of the quest to fashion a theoretical meaning of temperature. And it was a quest that taxed reflective minds, as he said in his talk, in the 18th century, De Luc, Josiah Wedgwood, and on into the mid-19th century to the notion of absolute temperature that was fashioned by William Thomson. Well, today, though, Hasok took us on another quest as well, and that was through the whole world of paradox, the paradoxes that are inherent in the measurement of unobservables. Those attributes, those entities that we recognize to be unobservable. He talked about atoms, Dalton's atoms. But there are so many other paradoxes, of course, in the whole history of measurement, and we've touched on them during the day rather tangentially. I mean, what did an 18th or 19th century physicist think he was doing when he weighed an imponderable? I mean, how was he going about weighing something that was defined at the time as having no weight? It might be caloric, it might be heat, it might be electricity, it might be magnetism. Or in a similar vein, something that I think Jane referred to in passing, what did Coulomb think he was measuring with his electric torsion balance? Certainly electricity was deemed to be imponderable, and I suppose it would fall into the category of Hasok's unobservables, and yet Coulomb made those very precise measurements. So fundamental questions, and I think the papers have reminded us nevertheless, despite those questions, those doubts, that questioning of the whole measurement process. I think the papers today have shown how the groping, the measurement has proceeded and proceeded relentlessly in every age and every civilization, as James's paper showed very, very clearly. Back to ancient Egypt, the meticulously recorded dimensions of Solomon's temple in the Book of Kings, or back, if I can inject an Oxford dimension, back to the measurers. The measurers. Now, this was an exhibition that was curated by the director of the Museum of the History of Science, Jim Bennett, now 30 years ago, it seems like yesterday, and it was based on a very delectable painting that exists in the museum, and it's a painting of people. It's a late 16th century Flemish painting showing people measuring things. In the middle of the picture, there is the instrument maker who's preparing the plate of a sundial, and you can see all sorts of measurements of length of cloth on the right-hand side, the measurement of the quantity of grain in a container in the middle, and there are measurements of all sorts and measuring tools along the front of the picture there. And that, I think, that was really reminded us, and that was the purpose of the exhibition in the History of Science Museum, that reminded us of the way that measurement entered everyday life. It's meant to be a picture of everyday measurement. So we certainly have looked at those early periods, but also we've looked in other papers at the very modern period. We looked at Richard Brown's National Physical Laboratory, the work of the National Physical Laboratory, or the work of the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris, which was founded, as Richard reminded us, was founded in 1875, a very interesting episode just after the Franco-Prussian War, when I think France was trying to assert its leadership role in Europe. And so I must say I would see this bureau as being something of a coup by the French, who were trying to establish France and Paris as the capital of measurement. And they set up this international bureau on the outskirts of Paris with such an aura around it that even during the Second World War, when Paris was occupied by the Nazi forces, the Nazis did not enter this space. I mean, this space was sacred almost and preserved. And it survived, not only survived the war, but survived absolutely untouched and, in a way, untroubled. So that's the world that Richard evoked for us, National Physical Laboratory, this International Bureau of Weights and Measures, this world of extreme laboratory accuracy. And it's an almost sacred world, as I've suggested in looking at the Bureau there. Remember how the Grand Kilo, as we were told, was toppled as the international prototype because it had lost something like the 20 billionth of a gram, and that was enough for it to be condemned. Well, in that sort of statistic, and there were others that we've encountered during the day, in that sort of statistic, there's an obvious wow factor. I mean, the fact that the meter is no longer a rather grubby bar on a wall in Paris, a metal bar that you can see and touch, but it's now, is it 1 over 299 millionth of the distance traveled by light in 1 over 299th millionth of a second. And I think Hassock referred to the heroic, almost romantic qualities of measurement that you can read into the whole measurement story. And I think, but faced with that ability and that growing ability to measure to that level of accuracy, I think it's hard to see the history of measurement as anything but a history of advancing precision, improved instrumentation, a sort of inexorable unfolding of a sort of metrological triumph. But the papers today, and I think as a historian I'm of that tribe, I have to endorse that view. The papers today have reminded us time and again of the texture of the story, the gross texture, but also the fine texture, and also a question that, to my slight surprise, hasn't come up as prominently as it might have done, the pace of the process. One thing I think we haven't really dwelt on is a change that I think, for me, I've always felt was fundamental in the history of measurement, and that is the change in pace in particular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I think it's at that moment, round about 1800, it is at that moment that measurement really enters at least our Western consciousness, our Western culture, as very much a central activity. Jane West set that change. She referred to the change in the context of industrialization, as well as sort of Enlightenment ideals of objectivity and rationality and so on. Richard Brown exemplified it through the introduction of the metric system. That was his story, that story of Delambre and Méchain, their heroic efforts to define the meter as a fraction of the length of the meridian. And long ago, in the historical literature, Thomas Kuhn identified this period and this change as nothing less than what he called a second scientific revolution. And it was a Kuhnian revolution that saw aspirations, the procedures of measurement being transferred from astronomy, from mechanics, what he called the exact sciences, and applied for the first time to the newer Baconian sciences. Those were the sciences of heat, electricity, magnetism, which now, certainly from the 1760s onwards, from the late 18th century onwards, became targets or fields for the first time for measurement. So it's another example of the arrival, the primacy, I think, of the measuring act and activity. John Heilbronn looked at the same change at about the same time. He interpreted it as the emergence of a new standard model based on gravitational forces in the Newtonian manner, but also on the array of imponderables, heat, electricity, and so on. And it was, for Heilbronn, it was the new mission, or the mission of the new experimental philosopher, to measure those imponderables. And what Heilbronn and a group of colleagues, a dozen or so colleagues, presented in the book on the left was the notion of a quantifying spirit in the 18th century. Something that characterized, that I think really did probably have its focus in France, but was certainly European in scope. And what emerges in that book, and again it's a dimension that we haven't really looked at today, is it's not just, I think, a new sense of the power of numbers, the power of quantification, the power of measurement, but also the extent to which those measurements, that measurement could extend beyond the physical sciences to political economy, population, health, agronomy, and so on. And quite suddenly, I think, numbers had a persuasive force that mere opinion didn't, and I think that's an important historical change. And it was taken up in the book that has been referred to in one of the papers, Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers. And what Porter's showing in that book is how a new sort of expanded class of bureaucrats in Europe deployed numbers in pursuit of authority. And so numbers, measurement gave an authority that bureaucrats in particular didn't have. They would not been elected, they didn't have any divine right to authority, to power, but numbers and measurement gave them that authority. And the same theme of authority was taken up. Again, this is all happening in the mid-1990s, when I think there was a flurry of interest in measurement in another collective volume edited by Norton Wise. The title, of course, is clever. It's a pun on the twin meaning of values. The values that we read on the instruments, the values that were going on, becoming more precise and yielding that wow factor I referred to earlier, but also the values that society, that we, the non-scientists, that society as a whole attaches to measurement, whether it's measurements of everyday life or those unimaginably precise measurements of the standardizing laboratories. Which leads us back to a question that Jane raised, and again, it's come up by implication in really virtually all the papers. Why do we measure? Why measurement has become such a fundamental part of the human condition in the way that James noted it had. I mean, it's become so much part of the human condition that we don't really realize that we are swimming in it, we are surrounded by it, we are part of it ourselves. Well, that just to sort of remind us of an abundant literature revealing a textured past. And as I think today's papers have shown us, there's an awful lot more. There's a lot more of this nuanced, textured history for us to explore and to tell. And it won't be a linear story. The story of what James Vincent warned us against, the idea of this metrological triumphalism, the sort of triumphalism that seemed to be implied in William Thomson's famous statement about needing measurement if we were to understand things. I think that's not, I just wonder how much he really believed that. But he certainly said it, and of course it's very quotable. And so I think a history of measurement really in future must take account of the limitations of any sort of metrological march of progress. James's book does that very well. Certainly the empire of numbers has never been all-powerful. Powerful it has certainly been, but all-powerful certainly not. And in the question, somebody asked one of the questions, I think, I can't remember which paper it was, probably Richard's, but I'm not sure, about, or raised the possibility of resistance to this onward march of measurement and quantification. And certainly there's clear evidence in the French case of resistance, of the difficulty of imposing the new metric system on the French people. There was resistance really until the government took everything in hand in 1837 and just said the metric system is going to be imposed whether you like it or not. So I think we need to think about the limits of measurement and also perhaps finally about crucial areas of human experience that are recalcitrant to measurement. You know, how are we to measure the quality of life? How are we to measure well-being? How do we know? Do we know quantitatively when we've reached a satisfactory level of human rights? And the question is one that has been asked in some detail by Erwin Neuenschwander in the book, this a few years ago now. His book, Quantitas, or it's science between qualitas and quantitas, between quality and quantity. And what he's doing there is exploring, I think, questions of extreme urgency. And questions not only in the past, he goes right back to Aristotle, but certainly questions of relevance today. Relevance for agencies trying to make wise judgments about the allocation of resources and so on. There are challenges, and they cry out for criteria of judgment. How far quantity or quality can yield an understanding, an evaluation of some sort of those problems. The temptation is certainly to resort to measurement, but just as Theodore Porter's bureaucrats did, and just as administrators in our own day tend to do, yes, they certainly look for ways of measurement. There is this feeling that if the job's to be well done, then there should be measurements to support it. And yet, what they find is that there are things they can't measure, or at least they can't measure in a satisfactory way. With the absolute nature, we certainly can't measure with the sort of absolute nature of the scientific measures that scientists will achieve. So there's a sort of frustration. I mean, my sort of closing thought is, or question is, should they be frustrated? Perhaps we do very well, and perhaps, Joe, maybe there's a future conference here as well. Perhaps we do very well to reflect not only on quantity, measurement, and so on, and its power and the place it has in our civilization, but also on those other parallel entities, particularly those of a human qualitative nature. I'll leave it there, but it's been a great day, Joe. If I can just finally thank you, and thank you for bringing together what to me is so important, the scientific community, members of the scientific community, and my personal tribe, the historians, the philosophers, and administrators, and so on. I think we need to do more of this talking. It's been an exhilarating day for me, and I suspect for everybody in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Robert. And I propose that we give one last final round of applause to Joe for organising such a great event.